The ice groans, a sound like the earth itself splitting apart. Picture a man standing on the frozen deck of a great ship, his breath forming crystals in the savage Arctic air. The temperature has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Around him the ice pack stretches endlessly in every direction, a white prison that has held Hms Erebus and Hms Terror captive for 18 months. The wood of the ship shrieks as the ice tightens its grip, squeezing the hulls with the force of 1,000 tons. Below deck, 129 men huddle in darkness. Their provisions are running low. Scurvy has begun its cruel work, loosening teeth, opening old wounds. Some men whisper that the tinned food tastes strange, metallic. They don't yet know that the lead in the solder sealing those tins is slowly poisoning them. They don't yet know that their commander, Sir John Franklin, lies dead in his cabin. How does a modern expedition, the most advanced polar voyage ever mounted, simply vanish? What terror awaits in the frozen wasteland ahead? And why, 170 years later, would the discovery of their ships reveal secrets more horrifying than anyone imagined? To understand how 129 souls disappeared into the Arctic void, we must first understand the man who led them there. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old in 1845, a portly, genial officer with thinning hair and kind eyes. He looked more like a country vicar than a legendary polar explorer. But Franklin had already spent years in the frozen north. He had survived an earlier Arctic expedition so harrowing that his men had been forced to eat their own leather boots, an ordeal that earned him the grim nickname, the man who ate his shoes. Yet Franklin remained optimistic, even cheerful. He believed deeply in British superiority, in God's providence, and in the civilizing power of His Majesty's Royal Navy. The Royal Navy itself was in transition. The Napoleonic Wars had ended 30 years earlier, and Britain's massive fleet now sought new purposes. The Northwest Passage, a navigable route through the Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, had become an obsession for the Admiralty. Whoever discovered this passage would secure a commercial advantage worth millions. More importantly, they would win immortal glory for the crown. Franklin lobbied hard for command of this expedition. His previous Arctic ventures had ended in partial success and bitter disappointment. Now, as his career drew toward its close, he saw one final chance for redemption. He petitioned the Admiralty directly, calling upon old friendships and political connections. When the command was finally granted, he wept with joy. The expedition would consist of 2 ships, Hms Erebus and Hms Terror. Both were bomb vessels, originally designed to withstand the shock of firing heavy mortar, and both had already proven themselves in Antarctic waters under James Clark Ross. For this Arctic voyage they were reinforced and refitted at enormous expense. Their bows were sheathed in iron. Steam engines and retractable propellers were installed, cutting-edge technology for 1845. Their libraries held more than 1,000 books. It carried 3 years' worth of provisions, including 8,000 tins of preserved meat, soup, and vegetables. On paper, it was the most advanced polar expedition ever assembled. Franklin chose his officers carefully. Captain Francis Rodden Moira Crozier would command Hms Terror. Crozier was Irish, 49 years old, and deeply experienced in polar navigation. He had sailed to both the Arctic and Antarctic and understood ice better than almost any man alive. He was also melancholic, introspective, and prone to bouts of dark pessimism. Though Crozier respected Franklin, he harbored private doubts about the expedition's timing and preparedness. Serving as commander aboard Erebus was James Fitzjames, a dashing 33-year-old officer with movie-star looks and an aristocratic bearing. Fitzjames was everything Crozier was not: charming, optimistic, beloved by high society. Yet beneath his confident exterior, Fitzjames carried a secret shame. He was illegitimate, the son of an extramarital affair, and spent his life striving to prove his worth. The crew comprised 24 officers and 110 men. They were hand-picked sailors, marines, engineers, and ice masters. Some were Arctic veterans. Others were young men seeking adventure and advancement. They believed in their ships, in their officers, and in the righteousness of British imperial ambition. On May 19, 1845, Hms Erebus and Hms Terror departed from Greenhithe on the River Thames. Crowds lined the docks, waving handkerchiefs and shouting farewells. Flags snapped in the spring breeze. The ship's bands played patriotic airs. It was a scene of triumph and pageantry. They had no way of knowing that not one of them would ever return. Chapter 1. Into the ice. The voyage north proceeded smoothly. Erebus and Terror sailed across the Atlantic. stopping briefly in Greenland to take on supplies and discharge a handful of men who had fallen ill. In late July 1845, the ships encountered a whaling vessel, the Prince of Wales, in Baffin Bay. The whalers spoke with Franklin's men, who were in high spirits. The weather was good. The ice appeared manageable. Franklin anticipated reaching the Pacific within 2 years. The whalers watched as the two ships sailed westward into Lancaster Sound, their dark hulls disappearing into the Arctic haze. They were the last Europeans to see Franklin's expedition alive. The ships pressed deeper into the maze of channels and straits that make up the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Franklin's orders were clear: sail west and south, threading through the islands until he emerged in the Pacific. Simple in theory. In practice, the Arctic is a labyrinth where ice conditions change daily, where channels that appear navigable one week become choked with bergs the next. Still, that first summer held promise. The ships covered significant distance, navigating through Lancaster Sound and into Wellington Channel. The officers conducted scientific observations, measuring magnetic variations, recording temperatures, cataloging wildlife. Fitzjames wrote in his journal about the beauty of the midnight sun, the strange luminosity of the ice. As autumn approached, the expedition made camp for the winter at Beechey Island, a desolate outcrop on the southern coast of Devon Island. Here the ships would wait out the long polar night, frozen into the ice until the summer thaw. Chapter 2. The first death's winter came down like an iron fist. By mid-October the sun vanished below the horizon, not to return for 4 months. Temperatures plunged to 50 below zero. Outside, the Arctic night was absolute darkness, so complete it seemed to press against the eyes. Inside the ships, the men lived by the flickering light of oil lamps. Despite the cold and isolation, life maintained a veneer of civilization. The officers hosted theatrical performances. The men exercised on deck, chipping away ice. They attended Sunday services where Franklin read from the Bible. The steam heating systems kept the ships relatively warm. Food remained plentiful, but in January 1846, Petty Officer John Torrington fell gravely ill. He suffered from pneumonia and tuberculosis, his lungs filling with fluid. The ship's surgeons could do nothing. On January 1st, 1846, Torrington died. He was 20 years old. The crew carved a grave into the permafrost of Beechey Island, backbreaking work in frozen ground. They buried Torrington in a coffin, covered him with stones and gravel, and erected a wooden headboard bearing his name. 3 weeks later, Royal Marine William Braine died. Then, in April, able seaman John Hartnell succumbed to tuberculosis. 3 men dead before the expedition had even left its winter quarters. The officers recorded the deaths in the ship's logs, but maintained discipline and routine. Death was not uncommon on Arctic expeditions. These losses, though tragic, did not portend disaster. Or so they believed. Chapter 3. The trap closes when the summer sun returned in May 1846. The ice around Beechey Island began to fracture. By late July, Erebus and Terror broke free and resumed their voyage. They sailed south through Pelée Sounder, bold choice, as this route was largely uncharted. Franklin was gambling that the ice conditions would be favorable. At first, the gamble seemed to pay off. The ships made good progress through August, covering hundreds of miles. The officers began to believe they might actually complete the Northwest Passage before winter returned. But on September 12, 1846, everything changed. North of King William Island, in a stretch of water later named Victoria Strait, the ice stopped them cold. Floes surrounded the ships, pressing together, thickening. Within days, Erebus and Terror were completely beset, trapped in an iron grip of ice. The officers were not immediately alarmed. They had weathered one winter. They could weather another. Provisions remained adequate. The ships were sound. They would simply wait for the 1847 summer melt. But the summer of 1847 never came. Not in any meaningful way. The ice that held the ships did not break. It groaned, shifted, piled higher, but it did not open. Month after month, the temperature remained brutally cold. The Arctic summer that should have freed them proved unusually harsh. By September 1847, when the next winter descended, Erebus and Terror had not moved an inch. 12 months imprisoned in ice. 12 months of dwindling hope, chapter quatern sickness and suspicion. As the second winter deepened, morale began to fracture. The men had now spent more than 2 years away from home. The endless darkness, the howling wind, the relentless cold all took their toll on the spirit. But far worse was the creeping realization that something was wrong with their health. Scurvy appeared first. The classic scourge of long voyagers, scurvy results from vitamin C deficiency. Gums become spongy and bleed. Old wounds reopen. Teeth loosen and fall out. The body essentially begins to disintegrate from within. Despite their stores of tinned vegetables, supposedly rich in nutrients, scurvy spread through the crew like wildfire. The men also began to exhibit strange symptoms that went beyond scurvy. Some suffered severe gastrointestinal pain. Others became confused, irritable, prone to violent outbursts. A few reported a metallic taste in their mouths, a persistent sensation that wouldn't fade. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they were being... The tins of food upon which they depended had been sealed with lead solder. In the rush to provision such a massive expedition, corners had been cut. The soda had been applied sloppily, in great beaded lumps that directly contacted the food. Over months and years, the lead leached into the meat and vegetables. Every meal delivered another dose of poison. Lead poisoning produces neurological damage. It causes confusion, irritability, and aggression. Combined with scurvy, tuberculosis, and the psychological strain of isolation, the crew of Franklin's expedition was deteriorating rapidly. The officers tried to maintain discipline. Crozier, who had assumed day-to-day command of the expedition due to Franklin's declining health, ordered strict rationing. He organized hunting parties to search for fresh game. But the Arctic offered little: a few seals, an occasional fox. Nothing sufficient to feed 129 men. Chapter 5. Franklin falls on June 11, 1847. Sir John Franklin died. The exact cause remains unknown. Perhaps it was scurvy. Perhaps pneumonia. Perhaps the cumulative effects of lead poisoning, age, and despair. The official record, later recovered, states simply, Sir John Franklin died. They buried him somewhere in the ice. The location has never been discovered. Franklin's death shifted command to Captain Crozier, who now faced an impossible dilemma. The ships had been frozen solid for 20 months. Provisions were running low, the men were sick, and the Arctic ice showed no signs of relenting. Crozier was a practical man. He understood that their situation was desperate, but he also knew that abandoning the ships, the most advanced vessels ever sent into the Arctic, would be an act of last resort. The ships contained warmth, shelter, supplies. Without them, the men would be exposed to the full fury of the Arctic wilderness. So Crozier waited. Through the winter of 1847 to 48, he hoped for a miracle. The miracle never came. Chapter 6. The decision by April 1848, the situation had become untenable. Erebus and Terror had been frozen in place for more than 18 months. 24 men were dead. Scurvy had incapacitated many more. Coal for the heating systems was running out. Food stocks were critically low. Crozier made the terrible decision. They would abandon ship. On April 22, 1848, Commander Fitzjames and Captain Crozier drafted a note. They recorded the key facts: Franklin's death, the date, the location, the number of casualties. They placed this note in a can at Victory Point on King William Island. The note read, in part, April 25, 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April. 5 leagues NNW of this, having been beset since the 12th of September, 1846. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. Total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. 105 men prepared to march south toward the Back River, hundreds of miles away across the ice. They hoped to reach a Hudson's Bay Company outpost, or perhaps encounter Inuit who could help them. It was a desperate plan, but desperation had become their only companion. The men loaded supplies onto wooden sledges and small boats mounted on runners. They brought far too much silverware, books, brass curtain rods, button polish, items that revealed their inability to fully comprehend their predicament. They still clung to the trappings of civilization, even as the wilderness prepared to devour them. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in the annals of exploration. The march south was a death sentence executed in slow motion. The men hauling sledges across the broken ice fields faced conditions beyond human endurance. Jagged pressure ridges rose 30 feet high. Open leads of water forced lengthy detours. The temperature hovered around 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Each sledge weighed hundreds of pounds. The men, already weakened by scurvy and lead poisoning, could barely walk, much less haul such loads. They began to die quickly. Some simply collapsed and could not be revived. Others succumbed to exposure after falling through thin ice. A few may have died of lead-induced organ failure. The strong tried to help the weak, but strength was a commodity in desperately short supply. As the men perished, their bodies were left behind. There was no energy to dig graves in the frozen ground. The Arctic would be their tomb. Inuit hunters later reported encountering the ragged remnants of Franklin's men. The Inuit described emaciated, hollow-eyed men who seemed barely human, shuffling south in tattered naval uniforms, pulling sledges they could no longer manage. The Inuit offered help, but the British officers, still clinging to pride and suspicion of savages, refused. It was a fatal mistake. The Inuit knew how to survive in the Arctic. They understood how to hunt seals, build snow shelters, find fresh water. But the British officers would not abandon their certainty that European civilization was superior, even as that civilization killed them. And then came the final horror. According to physical evidence discovered more than a century later, the survivors began to practice cannibalism. Bones recovered from King William Island bore unmistakable cut marks, the signs of deliberate fleshing. Skulls had been split open to access the brain. Long bones had been cracked to extract marrow. In their final extremity, Franklin's men consumed their dead comrades. One set of remains, identified in 2024 through DNA analysis as Commander James Fitzjames, a handsome aristocratic officer who had charmed London society, showed clear evidence of cannibalism. His bones had been cut and broken by his fellow officers in a desperate bid for survival. Imagine the moment when that decision was made. The moral calculus required to cross that final threshold. The horror, the necessity, the absolute collapse of everything civilized man claims to hold sacred. None of them survived. By 1850, the last of Franklin's men had perished. Some died on King William Island. Others may have reached the mainland, only to succumb to starvation and exposure. Exactly how and where each man died will never be fully known. The Arctic keeps its secrets. The search and discovery back in England, concern mounted as the years passed with no word from Franklin. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, launched a tireless campaign to organize search expeditions. Between 1848 and 1859, more than 30 missions were sent to find the lost explorers. These searches mapped vast areas of the Arctic but found little concrete evidence. In 1859, an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock discovered the Victory Point known, along with skeletons and scattered artifacts on King William Island. The fate of Franklin's men began to emerge not as a story of triumph, but of disaster. But the ships themselves remained lost. Erebus and Terror had vanished into the depths, their locations unknown for more than a century and a half. Then, in September 2014, a Canadian search expedition located HMS Erebus in the waters south of King William Island. The ship lay in 40 feet of water, remarkably intact. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was discovered in Terror Bay, resting upright on the seafloor under nearly 50 feet of water. The discovery of the wrecks reignited interest in the Franklin mystery. Underwater archaeologists explored the ships, finding artifacts that offered new insights but also new questions. Both ships appeared to have been deliberately sailed to their final locations, suggesting that some crew members may have returned to the vessels after the initial abandonment. Was there a mutiny? A desperate attempt to reman the ships? The evidence hints at possibilities, but confirms nothing. In the end, all 129 men of Franklin's expedition perished in the Arctic. Not one survived to tell the tale. Sir John Franklin, aged 61, died believing his mission might yet succeed. Captain Crozier and Commander Fitzjames led the survivors on a doomed march towards salvation that never came. The youngest crew members, boys in their teens, who had joined seeking adventure, froze to death hundreds of miles from home. The Franklin expedition represents the hubris of an empire at its zenith. Britain sent the most advanced ships, the best provisions, the finest officers, and still the Arctic defeated them utterly. The tinned food meant to sustain them poisoned them. The technology meant to protect them proved inadequate against the ice. The cultural superiority that prevented them from learning from the Inuits sealed their doom. Today, the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror are protected as National Historic Sites. They lie in dark water, preserved by the cold, monuments to ambition and tragedy. The graves on Beechy Island remain undisturbed. 3 wooden markers standing watch over the frozen sea. The Franklin expedition reminds us that nature respects no flags, no empires, no claims of superiority. The Arctic was the Nand, remains today a realm where human arrogance means nothing and survival demands humility. Somewhere beneath the ice and stone of King William Island lie the remains of 129 men, who sailed into the unknown and never returned. Their bones tell stories of suffering, of endurance, of the terrible choices made when all hope is fled. The wind still howls across those empty spaces, the ice still groans and shifts, and the Arctic still keeps its secrets, yielding them only slowly, reluctantly, to those who come seeking answers in the frozen dark. If you found this story compelling, there are many more forgotten tales of survival and tragedy waiting to be told, stories of men and women who ventured beyond the known world and discovered that some passages, once entered, offer no way back.